July 1945, Downton Abbey. So, when is this fellow coming, George? Caroline Talbot, still in her WAF uniform, crossed the library floor and stood next to the desk by the window. Her brother looked up from his letters. Go and change, George, Lord Grantham told his sister. You know mother will have a fit if she sees you in uniform. Caroline, mahogany-eyed like her mother, rolled them at her brother and sighed heartily. She'll just have to get used to it, she told him, with more boldness than she felt. I'm a reserve, was a reserve at any rate. You were in the RAF, Georgie, and father approves. George Crawley turned back to his letter. Your choice, he said. Charlie Bryant's coming tomorrow. Funny how he had met him. An excellent wingman, he had been at Eton, a few years above George. I knew him at school, George continued, as his sister smoothed down her uniform proudly. He's a few years older than me. He came over to me on one of my first days at Oxenhope and told me he had been born at Downton. Caroline nodded her dark head. Shall we call for 11s? She asked. I can see if Cousin Marigold is free. Aren't the last of the evacuees going back today? Isn't she driving them? George asked, turning in his chair. Caroline took some steps towards the red, high-backed settees that were her first memory, and sat down. He got up and rang the pull. They are gone, Caroline told them. Cousin Sibby saw them off on the train yesterday. So, who did I see Marigold with this morning? Not Peter? He's not come back from Skipton yet, has he? Caroline shook her head. All three of them had been in the RAF. Peter Pelham had been in the Corps not far from Hexham, his family's home. But he regularly spent summers at Downton. All 5 cousins together. And Charlie Bryant had been put as George's wingman. George, aged just 18 in 1940, had been posted up at Acklington, having flown with his stepfather. The next logical step, aeroplanes, after motor cars. His mother had always smiled and waved, although George had always known how his father had died. Charlie had recognized him from school, and they had been friends ever since. They had fought what came to be known, the hardest day from West Malling, losing 8 of his closest friends in the space of 6 hours. Had Charlie not been so determined with feeding the bullets, had George not been able to almost know where the Luftwaffe had been before he had seen them. George radar, Charlie called him. They would never have returned. Caroline had soon joined them, at Harrogate, with Sibby, who had escaped with her father from France on the day of the Nazi invasion. They were coming back anyway, sailing up from Biscay. The terror of Dunkirk had been seen after the Sussex coast, and their ship had picked up many survivors. Both cousins had trained as nurses, but Caroline, having learned to fly with her father, with George, had a job of which she was extremely proud, flying Hurricanes and Spitfires to different RAF bases, freeing up men to fly, first, defense raids, and later, bombing raids. So, just Charlie Bryant, Caroline asked her brother, a little stiffly. Won't that be a little boring? Just the 4 of us? Oh no, George replied. I've also asked Christopher Blake and Kitty Gillingham. You know them, don't you? I know Kitty, Caroline said, hoping to hide her disappointment from her brother. She and Kitty had come out together, and a more spiteful young woman Caroline had never met. At least Sibby would be there. She tolerated no nonsense like that. But, before Caroline could dwell on the idea, Thomas Barrow appeared at the door of the library. You rang, Master George? Black-haired, tall, Barrow had never dropped the habit of calling the new Earl of Grantham by his childhood name. His mother, Lady Mary, had told Thomas Barrow he must call him your lordship, but George, who had known Barrow all his life, had insisted back he must be Master George, and even Mary Crawley had not argued with him. May we have tea, and a light luncheon? Barrow? For, say, 11? Barrow nodded. Very good, Master George, and he turned to go. Oh, Barrow, George asked, resembling for a moment his father, and Thomas had to blink several times to remind himself where he was. Are any of the children still with us? The evacuees? I do not believe so, Master George, Thomas Barrow told him. I believe Miss Sibby saw the last 3 back on the train to York yesterday tea time. Then I wonder who that was. Blonde-haired young man, walking in the grounds. George shook his head at the memory. Barrow swallowed. Why, it was the young man I told you about, Ernst Skoltz. Thomas told him. George frowned. Is that his name? He asked. He was looking for his family? Thomas hesitated. On the one hand, he would like to deny it. The thought of me Lucina, and now a boy claiming, with good reason, to be her son, was extremely painful. And yet, the idea of a boy having lost the family who had adopted him to an allied air raid, and had gone to extreme lengths to find her was altogether heart-stopping. He could only tell Master George the truth. I was going to come to speak to you about this, Thomas told him, but you have not been home. I wonder if I could beg an audience with you. The sooner the better, because Ernst, with an undisguised German name and accent he could do nothing about, was already getting himself into trouble with some of the other boys, none of which was any fault of his own. Mr. Melsley had reassured Thomas, and everything to do with the privations and loss of life and liberty resulting from a 5-year war against his homeland. It could not sit, and Master George could discover it all from no one else. There is no need to beg, Barrow. George laughed heartily. Whatever you have to tell me, it will all be fine, I am sure of it. And he was sure. 5 years of flying aeroplanes and risking death on a daily basis, not least from his mother reminding him of his duty at Downton, and the little thing of a young boy was small consequence. It involves a young woman who used to work here used to live here, Thomas told him. My, that does sound mysterious, Caroline commented. Her smile dropped a little when George frowned at her. Then, I will speak to you this afternoon. Bring young Ernst, is it? Thomas nodded. Bring him up to me when he returns from school. I will be happy to hear everything. And, he broke off, and glanced to the ceiling. Then, George Crawley paced to the window. Both Caroline and Thomas Barrow watched him as looked out. It took another minute or so before the hurricane roared over. George radar, Caroline told her brother, amused. Charlie's got that right. George turned, and smiled. By God, whoever invented radar saved my life more than once. I'll say good man. Thomas Barrow closed the library door. He stood outside it, stock still for a moment, touching the pocket of his livery in which 2 telegrams resided. He always carried them, one of Ernest, which he had written to his father, telling him about his love for Thomas. Milo had given it to him. The other was the one brought to him by a very officious man going by the name of Professor Frederick Lindman, who had seemed very full of himself, very clear of his own importance and very disparaging of anyone who had ever worked for Ernest Rutherford. It was he who had handed Thomas Barrow the telegram, bearing the news of Milo's death. If he had the words to explain to Master George, Thomas might have been able to educate him on the invention of radar. That evidence of Milo's research could be seen at the top of the very house, and on the church, and at the folly on top of the hill to the west. But Thomas did not, could not, and the last image he had of me Lucina that was lingering in his mind melted away as he strode to the downstairs steps.